Hello and welcome everybody. We are stoked to have you all. I'm going to give you guys all a minute while we wait for everyone to get situated and dialed in. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. We're just curious to see what's bringing you to today's webinar. Is it educational? Are you in the beginning stages of your third-party risk management program? A current prevalent customer? Are you lost? Let us know. Can't forget about some introductions here. My name is Ashley, and I work in business development here at Prevalent, and we are joined with three very special guests. Our very own project director, Joe Toley. Hey, Joe.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to meet you all today.
Our very own content manager, Thomas Humphreys. How's it going, Thomas?
Afternoon, good morning. All good.
And our very own VP of product marketing, Scott Lang. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Ashley.
And just a quick reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we will be sending out the recording along with the presentation slides shortly after the webinar. You're all currently muted, but we do love to see participation. So please put any questions in our Q&A box so we can go over them at the end of the webinar. Today, Thomas and Joe are going to be exploring the pros and cons of using ISO standards in your TPRM program. So gentlemen, I'll pitch things over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. And yes, hello, everyone. Very good morning, afternoon, and evening, wherever you are calling from. And today, yes, we'll be sharing with you some tips and overall thoughts around pros and cons of using ISO standards, specifically, obviously, the ISO security standards in your TPRM program. We've already covered some of the housekeeping, and hopefully we should have time, obviously, at the end for Q&A, as always. But as Ashley has indicated, please obviously keep them coming throughout the presentation and in the relevant QA section. A very brief introduction to both of myself and Joe. So I am the content manager. I've been with Prevalent for just over 5 years now, and working heavily in developing assessments frameworks based on the likes of ISO standards, NIST standards, and other regulations and laws pertaining to information security. And I'm joined by my colleague, Joe.
Hi, pleasure to meet you all today. I'm Joe Toley, the project director at Prevalent. I spend a lot of time working with clients to get their programs stood up and live and as efficient as possible. Often seeing clients use a number of different standards or assessment types or question sets within their program. So looking forward today to actually learning something from Thomas Humphreys about ISO 27036. So looking forward to the session.
So thank you, Joe. Let's dive right into the agenda. So we'll start with having a get to know the ISO security standards overall, before starting to sort of tease in the third-party element, third-party risk management element, and where it sits within those ISO standards. We'll then take a wider look at how we can map TPRM practices across to 27001 and bringing in some of those other standards that Joe alludes to, such as 27036. We'll then look at overall, thinking about some of the pros, some of the cons of using these ISO security standards, whether you're obviously just starting out in your TPRM program, or this is an existing exercise and you're looking maybe to switch standards and need to give some thought to what ISO means for you. And then, as always, an overall summary and some of the key takeaways, some of the key lessons learned and key points we'd like to consider the next time we're back in our office or just starting that discussion around our third-party program. So we start with getting to know the ISO standards. So as we know, the demand for third-party services is ever increasing, particularly over the last 12 to 18 months. There's a continued reliance on different services, different products, some specialist services and products, or outsourcing critical business components. Perhaps more importantly, however, we're seeing a growing threat across not only software, but across the supply chain overall. We only have to look at what's happening in the past few weeks and months with the likes of the MoveIt vulnerability and other vulnerabilities, ransomware and phishing attacks over the past couple of years. And what's been interesting there is not only has it targeted prominent and notable applications and solutions, but the fact that it's hit supply chains across different parts of the process, different parts of the end-to-end life cycle. And of course, with more and more third parties or suppliers, and the increase in that landscape means an increase or potential to increase distribution of product, service, and support, particularly across multiple geographies, and again, bringing its own set of risks when you're dealing with companies across the world, particularly in areas of particularly sort of sensitive nature, whether it's environmental risks, geopolitical risks, and so on and so forth. So obviously, it's important to build a strong core through your third-party management process, and it requires maintaining control of those third parties through strategic thinking. Those of you who are familiar with PDCA, this is a common acronym that's used by ISO, and means plan, do, check, act. And this is something that we always need to think about, particularly when engaging with any ISO standard, but not least 27000 or the 27000 series of standards. And it's taking across this concept of, with careful planning, careful governance, and the governance approach, so setting right from the top, objectives, targets, roles, and scene setting will then help enable us to take action, to identify risk and controls and plans to address risk. And that continual process of always checking what we're doing. Are we do what you do, say what you do, and please show us, making sure that whatever we're doing is constantly checked, constantly reviewed. And then obviously acting on it as well, having a process, having a governance approach to making sure that where risk is identified, where there are concerns across, in this case, the third-party landscape, we're taking appropriate action to make sure those risks are minimized in the best way possible. So we started getting to know these ISO security standards. So ISO, the International Standards Organization, 27001 is the international standard on information security. It's one of the older standards across ISO's sort of set of recognized frameworks. And ultimately, it's a framework that sets a scene around providing security risk and a very well-defined risk structure or risk approach, and then building controls around that to protect what ISO calls the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and information assets. It's the only certifiable standard across the family. It's important just to understand what this means when I say family. So it's very common for ISO to build a certifiable standard, the one that independent auditors can assess organizations against, provide certification against. But more often than not, you then see a series of other standards that can help complement that initial certified standard. So in this case, we have two more, 27002, that takes the controls of 27001, but provides very clear and very detailed implementation guidelines on how you address these controls, how you implement them, key considerations. There's another, perhaps more newer, more recent framework called 27036, which is a supplier relationship standard. And this is still under the banner of 27,000 families, so still under the banner of information security. But this is a unique standard in that it focuses purely on the supply chain lifecycle, from initial acquisition of a supplier all the way through to the end and exit agreements and the completion of contracts and agreements with the supplier, and all the necessary and pertinent aspects from A to Z.
And Tom, a few questions from me on 27,000 specifically. Is this a newer standard that's been introduced? Obviously, supplier relationship management is more of an important and critical thing nowadays. I'm just wondering if this is a new standard or something that's recently been developed.
So it's been around a few years. I believe the initial 27006 was around the 2013, 2014. So not as long as 27001 or its originator, the British Standard 7799. These are frameworks that have been around for many, many years. I think just over 20 years now. So 36 is very much a newer concept. But given the timeline, I think it's quite, well, yes, it's quite timely that ISO have brought this out, given the ever-increasing interest and focus around supply chain risk management in the wider life cycle. And it's an interesting framework because, as I say, it's specific to supply relationship. It actually mirrors some other similar frameworks, such as NIST 800-161 around cybersecurity, supply chain risk management. And so it really provides that good implementation and guidance around how to set up and engage with your suppliers from acquisition through to contract.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's some really good value with that particular standard in developing your own internal supplier relationship program. And we commonly see our clients and organizations assess their suppliers against the 27001 standard, against the Annex A controls. Is there value in just leveraging 27036 for developing your own program? Or is there also some value in leveraging some of the content from that standard in assessing suppliers so that we can make sure that they're managing suppliers correctly, pretty much taking a bit of management of that fourth party question? You know, how are our suppliers managing their own third parties?
Yes. Yeah, very good question. It's, I guess technically you could use it for both. So 27006, what's interesting about it is, personally, I'd say a good starting point is for your own internal use, because it really helps set the scene around acquisition strategy, for example, sort of building that strategic approach and working out, you know, how do we build contracts? But at the same time, yes, thinking about your own third-party engagement and how are they, if they're dealing with critical suppliers that are dealing with critical or accessing, say, critical security components or systems or information, certainly there is benefit to looking at, well, how is that third party, for example, shaping their own contracts with their third parties, your fourth parties, and so forth. So it does have application both ways. I think personally, though, I think there's a lot more strength implementing internally as an organization.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom.
Yes. 27001's always provided level requirements for identifying and managing security within third parties and the wider supply chain. Now, it's probably worth mentioning very recently, within the last 8 months, I guess now, 27000 went for an update. It's the first time since 2013. So a new 27001 2022 standard has come out. And these 4 areas have remained. They have been enhanced, and we can see that through the use of 27002. But the purpose of these areas within 27001 remains. So the idea about the need to identify information security when dealing with suppliers and the wider supplier relationship, working out what information security controls and requirements need to be included within an agreement, within a contract. So when you're first setting up a contract with a third party or supplier, looking at how security is developed across the wider supply chain, so not your immediate organization, but the wider sort of fourth and nth parties where appropriate. And that continual process to monitor, review, address changes in the supplier service. So when a new service comes up, that process to say, well, how does that affect us as a business? So these 4 areas have remained since the 2013 version. They still remain in the 2022 version. It's important to obviously recognize that it's not just these 4 areas, but there are other aspects of the framework of the standard that touch on the needs for supply for suppliers or the use of a supply chain. For example, in system development, if you outsource development, the requirement for outsourcing development activity still remains, or the use of outsourced maintenance of say hardware and systems. So that still remains, but this focus is very much on dealing with the supply chain and the supplier relationship level. And as I say, with 27002, the purpose is very much to take those 4 aspects and enhance them. So what do we mean by a supplier agreement and considerations for information security, for example?
Yeah, and I take it, Tom. So here we have on the screen the ISO 27001 sort of areas that are
Yes.
managed relating to supplier management. And then the 36 version, does it cover the same areas? I'm just wondering if we could clarify the sort of value that one offers over another when looking at these sort of areas that exist in both.
Absolutely, yes. So to repeat from the beginning, it's important to recognize that 27001 firstly is the only certifiable standard. So that's the standard that, say, an independent auditor certification body will be looking at if they're going out and assessing an organization. So we're working very much on the requirement from 27001. As you expect from a certification standard, it can be very prescriptive, so a lot of should statements. So organizations should develop or identify security in a relationship. They should develop practices to monitor, review, and address change. 36 also has should statements, but it's very much a wider broad brush, almost like a checklist in many ways. It's looking at guidance in terms of, let's look at supply agreement in more detail. These are all the considerations. Obviously, yes, there is a lot of close collaboration, as you'd expect, for the fact that they're all part of the same family. But I guess the best way to think about it is standards like 36, and there are many other families of standards that touch on sector-specific controls and technological controls as well. They can be seen as enhancements. So they can take a 27,000 control and they can enhance it through extra considerations or extra thought to sort of grow or perhaps mature a 27,001 control.
Yeah, so 27,001 has the more sort of binary approach to controls, the control requirements, are they met? And then 36 offers more guidance and considerations about the program. Does that sound correct?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And this is where you can start to see there can be a good benefit to, particularly, well, regardless of whether you're going for certification or not, but using a certification standard, but then adapting or building on it with these best practice guidance, whether it's to grow industry-specific security controls or topic-specific, such as supply chain and supply relationships.
Brilliant.
So when taken with the wider set of security standards, we can see a lot of similarity in depth to enhance how we approach third-party risk in a similar vein to what we've just been discussing. So we've got these three standards, 001, 002, and 36. Certainly easier to say than 27,000 each time. So as explained, we've got 4 core controls that are specific to supplier information security in 27,001. Beyond that, there are 89 additional controls. It's actually a reduction since the 2013 standard. And these are controls that fit across the wider range of security matters. So from access control to personnel security, business continuity, so on and so forth. And underpinning 27,001 of the controls is this very well-defined and thorough risk management framework, and there that I'll touch on in a short while. 27,002 takes those same controls. Formerly, they are called Annex A controls. So these 93 security controls, and it provides enhanced guidance on how they're to be implemented. So, for example, where a control in 27,001 says an access management policy or an access control policy should be developed, 27,002 will expand that and say, these are the areas that you should consider putting into your access control policy. So it gives, again, in a similar vein to 36, it gives a wider sort of guidance on how you can implement each individual control. And then finally in 36, so follows again a similar process to 800-161, if anyone's familiar with that NIST framework, which is supply chain, cybersecurity supply chain risk management. And it's that methodical approach for the end-to-end lifecycle process from acquisition of supplier, profiling and tiering suppliers through to building a contract, identifying controls. So it's that very methodical approach to working out what requirements should we have or should we consider when we're going through that process. So it leans obviously again very heavily on 27,000 best practice or requirements, but takes that wider approach on the supply chain program.
Yeah. So for organisations that currently align or are certified to 27001,
yes,
that doesn't provide assurance that all of the considerations from 36 are covered. There is going to be some overlap, but there's going to be more information and more guidance and consideration and advice within 36. So it sounds to me like there's going to be some huge value in organisations actually using 36 as more of a standalone exercise to review those considerations, aside from 27001 completely, just to see whether they have incorporated some of those points in the program. And if not, they can start to leverage it to create some plan of action, some objectives for the program, set some success criteria over the next quarter, start working towards, ticking some of these considerations off.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I used the term checklist earlier on. You can imagine as a business, if you're looking at following a consistent framework, to take 36 and use it, as say, it's not certifiable, but certainly as sort of self sort of attestation, almost use it as that checklist piece to say, well, we need to develop third-party contracts. We need to build security in there. We're not too sure where to start. Here's a very detailed approach on these are the areas you should be considering when developing a contract or when building in security consideration within a third-party contract. So absolutely, yes, in terms of internal, let's say, sort of self-attestation and sort of improvement of your process. I think that's the other thing to take as well. It can be used not just for a company that's never done this before in supply chain management, but anyone who's already got an existing program. Like any of these standards, it could still be useful to explore and understand, are there best practices, are there tricks that we're missing?
Yeah, and I'm assuming as this standard is updated as well, this isn't a one and done type exercise where you check alignment, check the considerations off. It's going to change based on updates to the standard, but also updates to your approach internally. If you're dealing with new suppliers or more critical suppliers than you were last year, there's going to be different ways of approaching those and adjusting your internal processes to suit that as well.
Absolutely, and yes, you sort of hit the nail on the head there. Like any standard, ISO regularly review them. They don't always come out on a yearly basis, but yes, they do regularly update them to make sure they're still fit for purpose. And in that context, yes, you can imagine if you're starting to develop new business lines, for example, new product or services, then there's a lot of value in saying, well, this is new to us as an organization. Let's go back and make sure that what we're doing for other sort of service lines still marries up to what we're doing with this new service line.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's going to be lessons learned each year you review these as well. Did the contract prevent you from being able to conduct an audit when you needed to, or be able to communicate to the supplier as and when you needed to, or within a particular timescale, for example? Yeah, I can see this as a continuous evolutionary process to make sure some of these processes are up to date and efficient as well.
Absolutely, continued improvement is the way to go, Joe. It's favorite terminology amongst ISO and ISO auditors as well.
Yeah, you've already taught me a new analogy from one of your starting slides, which I've noted down. I've enjoyed.
Fantastic. So let's think ahead more around general mapping TPRM practices and sort of how it can fit into 27001 and 27006, and for that matter 27002 controls as well. So using requirements from 01, 36 and 02 can shape how we address a broader topic of TPRM. So if you think about from the top level, if we're just starting out looking at how do you go about identifying suppliers, how do you go about identifying what type of suppliers we need and what they fit into in terms of profiling, tiering, criticality of supply based on product and service. And so this is an example in 27036 through two controls on the right hand side: 611, the acquisition process; 612, the supply process. And these are areas that talk about the overall supply selection criteria and developing a framework, developing a strategy in terms of who takes ownership, who's managing the overall supplier selection. Is there a formal sort of yes or no process? And what areas do you need to consider when looking at brand new suppliers? It's also helped set the start for defining how do we go about defining security requirements, what considerations do we need from the get-go. So we can see where 36, perhaps more so than 27,001, can really drive into a bit more detail around, again, those checks and balances around, do we need to consider these areas? Do we need to look at risk in this manner right from the start when acquiring a third party, but as well as perhaps some questions we might be asking if we're looking at the concept of profiling and tiering or categorizing third parties as well. And what's interesting about 36 is, I say, it still has those control numbers. So from a guidance standpoint, this is where it can still be very valuable for an organization where you could take 36 in isolation, regardless of whether you're certified to 27,000 or not, and use it to sort of self-assess and provide that sort of checklist for a validation approach. Have you considered all of these steps in acquisition or the supply chain or supplier review process?
Yeah, and one thing I've sort of discovered from working with clients is this is often one of the downfalls of programs is this onboarding process, it not being fit for purpose or not collecting the right attributes about a vendor that can help further along down the line when it comes to the type of assessments that are required, the remediation process. So I'm wondering here whether this is more sort of a process exercise of making sure that we have reviewed the types of things we ask at point of onboarding, or whether it goes to the real specifics of attributes that determine that a vendor is a tier one. Where's that line that this standard stops and there's actually requirements for sort of internal exercises to make some decisions on the specifics? Yes,
interesting question. So 36, I'd say it's firstly, it should always be taken that it is a guidance standard. So it will not always be as prescriptive as, say, a regulation or certifiable standard, but it does go to a relatively granular level. So if I take the example of contracts, as we'll see later down the line, it does touch on recommendations in terms of what security controls a company should consider. So should you consider controls around incident management or incident reporting, for example, or change management and change reporting? So where third-party changes operations or processes or technology, or if they suffer a data breach, for example. And so it does start to give some good, clear sort of guidelines and expectations in terms of these are perhaps the controls we should be asking on our third parties or incorporating into agreements or incorporating into questionnaires or whatever the approach is. So it does go to a certain level, and it's important to note as well that any of those considerations are aligned to the 27,000 controls. So at the back of 36, it does have a one-for-one mapping. So for example, where 27,001 touches on the need for background checks for staff contractors coming on site, there'll be a similar human resource control within 36 that touches on consideration from a supply standpoint and some of the controls or areas you can consider if you need to go through background checks with a third party. So it is interesting that it does provide a level of granular detail, but at the same time remaining relatively wide, I guess, as you'd expect with an ISO standard, being that they need to be adopted by any industry, sector, and size of business.
Yeah, of course. I mean, every organization is going to have a slightly different risk appetite. It's going to engage with different types of vendors and different services. So yeah, that makes sense. It makes it a more universal approach.
Very much so. Absolutely. Thinking ahead to a next key point is obviously defining those information security requirements. So thinking back to 27,001 controls, saying, A, have you identified where information security sits in the supply chain? But secondly, where it sits in terms of contracts. What controls do we need to make mandatory for suppliers, for example, before we engage with them and their service offering? And from a 27,001 perspective, we're looking at this risk management methodology, this quite clearly defined risk management approach that 27,001 starts off in. And then from a 27,001 and 2 approach, it's those specific clauses, so 519 and 520, for example, are specific controls or clauses around developing those information security requirements and defining agreements and what goes into an agreement. On the 36 side, again, we can see specific clauses that touch again on risk management process, but also supplier relationship agreements, so part 731. And we can start to see when we look at both of these, there's a lot of similarity in terms of the expectation and the guidance, but also the requirements from 01 as well. So they could cover these in a bit more detail. So what is 519? So the requirement in 27001 says processes and procedures should be defined, should, I guess being the operative word there, and implemented to manage information security risk associated with supplier product and service. And 5.20, relevant information security requirements should be established and agreed with each supplier based on the type of relationship. It is important to note, actually, for anyone where version 2022 is new, these two clauses refer to the old A1511 and A1512 in the 27001 assessment or standard, sorry. So you've got clue 2, very well defined sorts of process requirements from the standard. As you can see, should be defined, should be implemented, information security requirements should be established and agreed. And I mentioned that obviously these two are very specific to supply chain, but as we'll see over the next 1 or 2 slides, this also points to the wider use of the 27001 standard. And these controls should never be taken in isolation. And what 27002 does is it expands them and starts to draw on the other 89 controls in the standards framework. So, consideration for access control, data backup, data security standards, personnel, incident management, so on and so forth. And it starts to broaden out the consideration that, well, what control should we be using? Where do we even start? We start with the 89 other controls that the standard provides us. And using 27002, it helps us to work out, well, how do we implement them, or which ones are important to us, or which ones should we be using when engaging with our supplier. It's always quite a difficult area to think about because obviously each supplier is different, each product and service is different, and also the complexity of each third party. So it can be quite a time-consuming area that requires a lot of thought. And again, this is where 36 can then come in a very helpful manner, because 36 offers proposals in terms of this is what an agreement should look for, this is what an agreement should consider. So we can see at the bottom here, security controls required across information, ICT security, personnel, physical security, use of change management, incident management, any form of compliance monitoring or enforcement. So 36 is already starting to draw on some of the controls, some of the areas that 27002 will also pick up on. And so this is again where you can see some of the benefit of saying, well, we want to use 27001, or we need to use it for various purposes. And it gives a certain level of consideration. But 36 also offers a lot of different areas that we need to be thinking about within our supplier agreement. And it may be that there are areas that have not been considered before. We haven't considered the use of change management. Actually, yes, based on what the third party is doing, if they're managing critical systems and applications for us, actually change management may be very, very vital, particularly our significant changes that impact our applications or our systems or our data as well. So it may be that this is a mandatory control that we implement within our supply contract in a similar vein to incident management, should the third party suffer any form of physical security or data breach or anything else that harms or has a potential to harm information and systems managed by the third party. So you can see a good blend between how 36 requirements can expand and discuss more broadly, have you considered these areas within the contract, and the more specific areas around 27001 and 2 around we need to think about A, B, C, and D in terms of defining or recording security requirements.
Yeah, and seeing the 36 requirements there mapped out really starts to allow you to build those links between the considerations of what you might be doing internally as well. So if you
Yes.
are using this as a checklist or as a form of internal audit, you could actually use this as a standard to start mapping your own internal controls against them to then define whether you've performed a review of your change management process, for example. When was it performed and who by? So you can start using this as more of a a living standard that you can assess yourself against, and
Yes.
a repeatable process as well. So yeah, it's nice to see this start to link back to specific controls and processes.
Absolutely. And it's always important to note, a lot of this obviously revolves around a very successful and well-developed risk management process. Obviously, the more we've identified, our key supplier risk, obviously the easier it's going to make to identify those controls. And then, as you've alluded to there, Joe, use of things like 36 to say, have we considered this, and how do we approach it with our third party as well. And so, yes, there's a good relationship between all three of these standards and many others across the 27,000 family. By developing a clear risk management framework, coming back to the second point, organizations can issue and manage obviously control assessments that draw on a structured, and apologies, it's tailed off there, but it's issuing and managing security assessments to third parties. What does this mean? So I've already mentioned 27001 has very well defined a set of security controls, those 89 plus those 4 specific to third parties. And again, this is where we've drawn the second set of clauses, so 521 and 522, which is all about monitoring, reviewing, and addressing changes in supplier services. And again, we can draw on ISO 27036 around their risk management process, because it's within the risk management process of 36 that starts to pick up some of these monitoring activities as well. So in 27001, 521 requires processes and procedures shall be defined and implemented to manage information security risk associated with product supply chain. And the organization shall regularly monitor, review, evaluate, and manage change in information security practices and service delivery. And obviously this monitoring, review, and evaluation piece is quite critical. Again, it's been in place for 27001 since the original standard. And again, it's an area that's also enhanced across 36. What do we mean by obviously monitoring, reviewing, and evaluation? It's consideration for how do we respond to trying to understand those controls, those requirements that the third party has in place. Are they being met? How successful are they? So performance reviews, audits, remote audits, setting SLAs, any other process or any other requirement that can give us confidence that the third party is doing what they say they do. And again, in a similar vein, 27002, drawing on those initial controls and expanding them. So what do we mean by how do we respond to a change? So where a supplier has changed processes, added in new processes or technology, for example, what does that mean for us as a business? So it's starting to get companies to think about the impact assessments of what those changes mean and how do we respond.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important one to emphasize, because the earlier we take a step back and look at the 27,036 controls around, potentially things that might need to be introduced into contracts, the earlier we do that, the more chance we actually have of managing a supplier in the right way.
Yes.
It's very often difficult to introduce these things later on in a contract, or if there's nothing in terminology, it's very difficult to refer back to these at a later date. So I think it's really important to step back and review these as early as possible.
Absolutely. And again, it's that continual process of saying, is what we're recording, is it fit for purpose? Particularly as it grows and it matures as well. It's always important to stay on top of that process and make sure that what we're doing is correct and also obviously aligned to our own business practices. kept on talking about risk management a few times, and just want to underline again that importance of risk management within 27,000. So the framework establishes quite a structured approach in terms of how companies go about identifying risk, recording and documenting risk, aligning it to this concept of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information and information assets, and then setting a framework for identifying risk acceptance criteria, for example, risk remediation and treatment plans, and obviously risk ownership as well within the business. And although it can apply internally within the organization, it's also a suitable framework to apply when you're thinking about supply chain risk management as well. You can still adopt the same methodology and approach of, have we really identified our true supply risks? And do we have a process to monitor, measure, manage, review, and take ownership of those risks, or at least engage the vendor to make sure those risks are managed appropriately? And obviously all this leads into risks which can be unique depending on criticality of suppliers, type of services, type of activities they're providing to us, overall complexity of those suppliers. There'll be some risks that are different from supplier to supplier based on, for example, whether they're handling sensitive or personal information, for example, and then there's data security risks to those companies developing applications and software solutions, to companies that are offering neither of those and have very little interaction with sensitive data, for example. And obviously, the purpose within 27001 is, by developing that structured approach to risk management and identifying the level of impact to CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, should help manage what security control requirements we are using. What's interesting with the current version of 27001 is it does expand on the concept of categories and categorization of control requirements. It actually splits them across people requirements, operational requirements, technological requirements, and so forth. So it has quite clear structures that can help organizations work out what are the best controls for us that we need to be asking our third parties about. And as you can see from the amber arrow, going backwards again, looking at how effective is that risk management framework, and do we need to adjust for new and emerging risk? So again, thinking about, as we discussed at the beginning, at the top of the hour, the beginning of the session, around ever increasing volume of ransomware attacks, phishing threats, and other similar vulnerabilities, thinking about the risk we've already explored with our supply chain. Do we need to add additional ones because these are becoming more common? And so we need to explore controls around how they're adapting or predicting or managing these type of threats through security awareness training, for example. So taking a look back now in terms of some of the pros and cons of using the ISO standards. So I think it's certainly true that using the 27,000 framework and the series of standards can certainly be very invaluable when designing or complementing or improving your TPRM. Firstly, the fact that 27001 is an internationally recognized and certifiable standard in information security can go a very long way. It's adopted across almost every country in the world by a lot of different organizations and industries and sectors. And it is seen even now as a strong stamp of an organization's sort of approach and due diligence and implementation of best practice frameworks around security and having a good security posture. As we've explored today, using 27001 but complementing it with other standards like 02 and 36 can allow for a more in-depth approach and structured framework for managing third-party programs. So taking the requirements of 27001, building on top of it, implementation guidance from 202, and best practice around the wider supply chain lifecycle in 36, and other best practice standards, so you can give a much more detailed and perhaps even more mature framework moving forward. And the use of a very clearly defined risk management approach within 27001, if done correctly, is always can always help in making sure the controls that you select are the most appropriate. So some very good, I think, positive comments to say about 27001, particularly if you're looking at the advantages, say, or disadvantages of using it over, say, NIST and other frameworks, but not least that international recognition and the fact that that family is also growing. So you'll find that there are other frameworks that are sector specific, for example, that could also be of benefit to implementing and maturing those 27001 controls. However, it is important to remember the following as well. So 27001 in isolation may not cover the complete TPRM life cycle as you've seen through 36, where there's more emphasis in 36 on areas such as acquisition, supplier acquisition. It also covers other areas around exit and exit agreements or exiting from an agreement with the third party. And these are areas that are either loosely covered or not covered at all in 27001. And so that's why that benefit of using 01 with other frameworks can be of more use. The standards themselves, regardless of whether you're certified or not, the standards are not free. There's a cost involved in each standard. So obviously, the more family of physical standards I'm talking about here, there's necessary cost implications in that. And of course, in a similar vein, if you go through certification, there's always something to bear in mind. Controls are wide-ranging. It still covers a lot of I guess, the usual topics. I mentioned sort of asset management, access control, incident management, and so forth. Perhaps it doesn't always cover the technical depth of, say, 853, however, where they both touch on the need for a secure development lifecycle, a segregation of systems or development environments, for example. But NIST will take that same topic, but then expand in a bit more depth in terms of extra consideration. So depending on your appetite and how in depth you need to go, it could be a perfect fit, or it may not touch all those technical areas that you're after. Say if you're higher tier vendors, if you're of that mindset or going down that route.
A very quick, sorry,
yes, Joe.
A very quick question on this. Is there a mapping between 36 and NIST to give you some advantage of seeing what's covered, but as more of a free resource that could be leveraged to get an understanding of the considerations?
So not directly within the 36 framework, or the current iteration, which is the 2022 version. I'm not aware of a direct mapping. There's a mapping, of course, between 27001 and 36, as you'd expect. However, I mentioned at the top of the discussion that there's a similarity with 800.161, which is the cybersecurity SCRM, and when you're looking at both of them, there is a very good relationship and in terms of the core topics and how both of them are structured from the outset of supply chain management through to the end. And chances are, as we accept with many of these standards, particularly given the close relationship between ISO controls, NIST controls, and other controls, that over time we will see a greater mapping and sort of alignment between frameworks to say, this is the difference between what NIST says versus what ISO says versus something else.
Thanks, Tom.
So to take a quick think about what can we do now. So obviously, firstly, it's about identifying your third parties. If you haven't done already, that process of adopting sort of tiers, profiles, criticality of organizations based on criticality to the business, whether you're adopting rating systems based on high, medium, lows, red, amber, greens, or something more acute based on their access to information assets, their access to personal information, for example, and starting to profile those third parties to identify how we tier or categorize them. So is personal data being handled, for example? Are they providing a service that's very unique and they're a single source supplier, for example, or concentration risk? And once you've adopted this, and again, some of the benefits of 27036 around the acquisition process, start to use 27001 to drive that risk assessment process using that dedicated framework. So how it goes about identifying security risk, defining supplier services to start supplier sort of information and access to systems, and then identifying owners who's going to be managing those supplier risks, and what acceptance criteria are we defining. Are we having a separate criteria for the type of supply risks, or are you using a wider business risk acceptance criteria based on wider business risk and risk management processes? And then defining that risk treatment approach. How are we going to respond to supplier risk? Do we have clear remediation plans in place based on, say, recommendations and best practices from 27002? I've already explained that a single control is expanded quite significantly into 27002. Do we want to use that as part of our risk treatment and recommended actions should a risk present itself? Obviously, then assessing and determine those control requirements. What do we actually need to look for within our third parties? Using those best practices to develop an agreement. So thinking about 36 and those almost checklists of how we thought about incident and change management, or how we thought about personnel security, and starting to underline those requirements within an agreement or within a service contract. It's always worth identifying in this part. There'll always be some third parties where you don't have a control over those contracts. If you're thinking about perhaps some of those large cloud service providers, such as AWS and so forth, it's more we buy into their services, but you can still use these processes to conduct due diligence. Have we considered these areas? We've identified the key security controls that are important to us. Can we see whether these have been applied or these are in place for those type of supplier engagements? And obviously making sure that those controls are in place are based on those 27001 and 2 requirements. And then finally, that process of executing that assessment. And again, that continued process of monitoring, reviewing, evaluating suppliers. It's looking at 5.21 and 5.22 in the standard. But on top of that, obviously going through the same monitoring, review, and evaluating the TPRM process. So if you're using 36, if we're using another framework, if we're just using 27001, is it still fit for purpose? Do we need to look at, again, how we're identifying risks, information requirements, and monitoring processes as well? Before we head over to questions, I believe we have a short piece from Scott.
Yes, sir. That's right, Thomas. If you could stop sharing, I'll share on my end. All right. All right, quick check. Can you see my screen okay?
See it clearly.
Awesome. All right, just very briefly, I want to leave plenty of time for questions because I've seen a few come through so far. I just want to touch briefly on how Prevalent can help address your third-party risk management program requirements specific to ISO. When we talk to customers, what they tell us invariably that they want to accomplish are these 3 things. Number 1, get the data they need to make better decisions regarding third parties, whether that be some visibility into the risks that they pose to the organization prior to onboarding, or getting good data on their control environments and then validating those controls with external cybersecurity assessments or intelligence. Number 2 is increasing team efficiency and breaking down silos. The security team is probably responsible in your organization for performing the assessments of vendors and third-party suppliers, but chances are procurement or risk management or legal or audit all have some say in the matter. So how do you get everybody together in the same solution, looking at the same data to make good conclusions about or well-informed conclusions about the third party? And then finally, evolving and scaling your program over a long period of time, whether that's to accommodate new or fewer vendors, or kind of a longer scale operation to kind of mature the program over time and bring it up to best practice. So those 3 things are generally what customers tell us they want to achieve out of their program. And that's precisely what we helped organizations do. And that is, first and foremost, to simplify and speed up onboarding with a single source of the truth and a process to onboard and manage a vendor throughout the life cycle. Giving access to multiple different organizations throughout the enterprise, different teams, the data they need to see in the format they need to see it in order to make good and informed decisions about third parties. Second is to streamline the process and close gaps in risk coverage. Chances are you've got a couple different tools in place to do this or do that. Maybe using spreadsheets to assess your vendors, trying to line those up with ISO security controls, as the case may be, bringing in a couple of different data sources. We bring that together under one pane of glass, and then extend that pane of glass to pretty much anybody in the organization. Again, so that you're viewing and managing risk across the life cycle of that relationship. And unifying the teams accordingly. And as I mentioned, we address this for every stage of the relationship, from giving you the ability to add automation and intelligence to RFX processes, to giving you a single process and solution for onboarding, contracting, scoring inherent risks, enabling you to assess your vendors against any number of different risk requirements, from IT security and privacy all the way to ESG or anti-bribery and corruption, with a set of ISO specific assessments built in the platform as well to help you with controls mapping, to monitor and validate that information with multiple different sources of external intelligence. Excuse me. Manage SLAs and performance of those particular vendors beyond just security metrics, and then give you a very prescriptive process to eventually offboard and terminate the vendor once that relationship comes to an end. Excuse me again. And then we help to address multiple different areas of risk with the Prevalent platform. Again, I'll kind of go through this pretty quickly so that we have time for Q&A, but we've kind of bucketed those different risks into those 6 categories that you see here. Talked a lot about cybersecurity risks, security risks today in the upper left-hand area of that slide there, but we also address multiple different areas, not just from an assessment built in the platform, but also continuous monitoring data that we consume and help to calculate scores. We deliver a solution that is a combination of our expertise, the data we provide, and then founded by the platform. We can do everything from manage the hard work of onboarding, management, and remediation and assessment of those vendors on your behalf if you choose to do so. We can help you correlate what you find from those assessments with multiple different sources of risk data and intelligence, and then house that all in the platform for workflow, reporting, and ongoing management. Again, ultimately, at the end of the day, our goal is to help you be smarter in your approach to managing third parties, unify your processes, and help you be much more prescriptive in how you execute that program and grow that program over time. Last thing is, for me anyway, we produced something called the ISO third-party risk management checklist. It's a 30-page guide that we put together that takes a lot of what Thomas and Joe talked about today, mapped that to very specific capabilities and needs that you might have from a third-party risk management perspective, and then identified some best practices to help you get to where you're going. So, you can see a link for it there. I realize you can't download it from the slides here, but we'll be sending out these slides and the presentation for you tomorrow, so you can get access to that checklist. All right, that's all I wanted to offer today. I'm going to pitch it back over to Ashley. Ashley, I guess we can open up for questions now. Or maybe Ashley's not there.
Yeah, I can see we have one question I can probably cover off if we'd like.
Yeah, good deal.
Yeah, sure. Tom, we've had a question come in asking where we can find out more about ISO 27001. Obviously, it's a paid-for set of sort of family of frameworks and standards. If someone wants to dig into the detail of the controls and specifically the 36 requirement, where should they go as a sort of source for information or more data on what to expect?
So there's a few places in terms of just getting to grips with understanding what the standards are. Obviously, ISO themselves, the ISO and IAC, the organizations who develop the frameworks, do obviously provide abstracts on what those assessments are. Any local certification bodies as well, depending on where you are, but most certification bodies around the world will also have detailed overviews and assessments on what does the service, what does the assessment mean, what are the key or pertinent controls captured in each of those frameworks. So within the UK, anyone who's in the UK, the likes of BSI and other standards bodies such as them and also auditing firms. So there's a few different resources, there's a few different areas. But certainly ISO themselves, they do provide some quite handy abstracts actually to get to grips with, what's the difference between each framework and what can I expect, even down to a quick overview of each respective control.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay.
All right, everybody, we've reached the top of the hour. We want to be sensitive to everybody's time. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. A couple of other items before we close out. Yes, today's webinar was recorded. We will send that out to you tomorrow morning, the recording along with the presentation and some other helpful materials. Final question that came in, will you be doing a pros and cons of other frameworks or a comparison of the frameworks in the future? The answer is yes. Actually, Thomas and Joe have done this same type of presentation for NIST as well as SOC 2. And there may be some others coming on the horizon. All right. So once again, thanks everybody for joining today. Look forward to seeing you all very soon. We'll follow up accordingly. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.